In 1875, a Birmingham gunmaker stood before a panel of judges and stated, without qualification, that he had invented the single most important advance in shotgun ballistics of the previous 2 centuries. The judges did not immediately agree. His competitors had copied the geometry, filed their own variations, argued in print that the principle was obvious, that it had always been obvious, that no man could own a cone bored into a steel tube. He sued, he argued, he demonstrated, he published, and then he won. Within 15 years, every shotgun barrel submitted to the Birmingham Proof House bore the geometry he had described in that courtroom. Every major gun maker in Britain, Belgium, and America was producing barrels shaped to his specification, some under license, most without acknowledgement, almost none with attribution. The choke-boring revolution transformed wildfowling, competitive clay shooting, and military riot control across 4 continents. It is, by any technical measure, one of the most consequential single innovations in the history of the shoulder-fired firearm. The man who invented it, who defended it in court, who codified it in the most authoritative technical manual ever written on British gun-making, who held a royal warrant to the Crown and supplied police forces from Birmingham to Bombay, is today remembered by almost no one outside the rooms where his surviving guns are handled and priced. But the real story of W.W. Greener is not the patent he won. It is the story of what a gun maker does when he is right about everything, and what happens to the firm he leaves behind when the world stops caring whether anyone was right at all. William Greener Sr. was not a Birmingham man. He was born in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1806. In a city whose industrial identity at that moment was iron, coal, and the river. Not gunpowder, not barrel steel, not the subcontract garret workshops of the Midlands gun quarter. He arrived in Birmingham as a young man already formed by the North's engineering culture, practical, combative, convinced that the difference between a good gun and a poor one was a matter of measurement, not tradition. He was also, from early in his working life, a writer. In 1835, at the age of 29, he published The Gun, or a treatise on the various descriptions of small firearms, the first serious attempt by a working British gunmaker to codify the technical principles of his own trade in plain language, accessible to a literate civilian readership. The book was not a commercial manual. It was an argument that British gunmaking, for all its reputation, was operating on received habit rather than verified mechanical principle, and that the trade would not improve until it submitted itself to the same rigor it applied to the steel it worked. The Birmingham trade did not universally welcome this assessment. Greener Sr. settled in Birmingham and established himself in the gun quarter, the dense network of streets north of the city centre, centred on St. Mary's Row, Lench Street, and Weeman Street, where by the early 19th century several thousand craftsmen worked in the subcontract system that had made Birmingham the commercial gun-making capital of the British Isles. This system was not a factory. It was an ecology. A single finished gun might pass through the hands of a barrel maker, a lock maker, a stocker, an action filer, an engraver, and a finisher, each working in a separate workshop, often in a separate building, connected not by a production line but by a network of trade relationships, agreed tolerances, and the final submission to the Birmingham Proof House on Banbury Street for barrel proofing. Barrel proofing. The submission of each completed barrel to the proof house, where it is fired with an overload charge designed to exceed maximum working pressure by a defined margin. A barrel that fails proof is destroyed. One that passes receives the proof mark, a legal guarantee established by Act of Parliament in 1813 that the barrel is safe for service use, was the quality floor of the entire system. It did not guarantee excellence. It guaranteed minimum safety. The difference between the floor and the ceiling was craft. Greener Sr. understood this distinction precisely, and he spent his working life trying to raise the ceiling. He did not live to finish the project. William Greener Sr. died in 1869, leaving behind a workshop, a reputation, a body of published writing, and a son. William Wellington Greener was born in 1834. He was 35 years old when his father died, and the business passed to him. He had grown up inside the gun quarter trade, not as an observer, but as a working participant. He knew the subcontract system from the inside, which barrel makers on Lynch Street could hold a bore diameter to the tolerance a match-grade action required, which lock filers on Weeman Street understood spring geometry, and which ones were guessing, which proof house submissions came back failed because the steel had been sourced cheaply, and which because the barrel wall had been left marginally thin at the breech. He had also read everything his father had written, and he had formed the same opinion his father had formed, sharpened by another generation of direct observation. That British shotgun performance was being limited not by the metallurgy of the barrel or the chemistry of the powder charge, but by the geometry of the muzzle. The problem was pattern density at range. A smooth-bore shotgun barrel, a tube of uniform diameter from breech to muzzle, delivered its shot charge into open air at the muzzle, where the individual pellets immediately began to scatter under their own momentum and the turbulence of the propellant gas escaping behind them. At 20 yards, the pattern was acceptable. At 40 yards, it had opened to a diameter that left meaningful gaps. Gaps wide enough for a driven pheasant, a crossing pigeon, or a fast-rising grouse to pass through untouched. The sporting shooter compensated with experience and lead calculation. The result was still, by Greener's assessment, a mechanical inefficiency that better geometry could correct. The geometry he proposed was the choke, a gradual constriction of the barrel bore in the final inch or two before the muzzle, tightening the internal diameter by a precisely calculated fraction, typically between 5 and 40 thousandths of an inch, depending on the degree of choke, that squeezed the shot column into a tighter mass at the moment of exit and sustained that tighter pattern over greater distances. He had not invented the principle from nothing. Constricted muzzles had been experimented with in America and on the continent. What Greener contributed was the systematic measurement, the documented ballistic results, and, critically, the legal claim. In 1874, he filed a patent, and then he prepared to defend it. By the time the patent dispute reached its resolution, the Greener Works at St. Mary's Row employed, by trade catalogue accounts of the period, several dozen craftsmen across barrel-making, actioning, stocking, and finishing operations, a scale that placed Greener above the typical one-room garret workshop of the gun quarter subcontractor, but well below the integrated factory floor that BSA was already assembling at Small Heath. The capital the firm carried was not financial. It was intellectual. A name, a patent, a textbook, and a claim that the firm intended to defend in every court available to it. The defense began almost immediately. The patent dispute of 1874 was not a quiet legal formality. It was a public argument about who owned an idea. And, in the Birmingham gun quarter, where every craftsman's livelihood depended on the freedom to work the techniques that had been common trade knowledge for generations, that question carried consequences far beyond a single firm's balance sheet. Greener's competitors argued the obvious, that constricted muzzles had been known before his patent, that the principle belonged to no one, that a man could not fence off geometry. They were not entirely wrong. Experimental choke borings had appeared in American gun-making literature in the late 1860s. A Midlands maker named Pape had filed an earlier claim. The trade pressed these precedents hard. Greener pressed harder. What he had that his competitors lacked was documentation. Systematic field trials, conducted with measured shot charges at measured distances, recording pattern densities against a standard paper target at 40 yards. The kind of empirical methodology his father had argued for in 1835, and that W. had spent the intervening decades applying to his own workshop practice. When the dispute reached its resolution in Greener's favor, by one account through a Sporting Life-sponsored public trial in 1875 that demonstrated the choke-bored barrel's pattern superiority against a standard cylinder bore under controlled conditions, he did not simply accept the vindication and return to the bench. He published it. The choke bore gun, issued in the years following the trial, laid out the ballistic case in terms that a sporting gentleman, a proof house official, and a competing gunmaker could all read and understand. The degree of choke: full, three-quarter, half, quarter, improved cylinder. Each constriction defined by its internal diameter reduction and its consequent effect on pattern density at specific ranges. The measurement methodology. The recommended powder and shot combinations. The proof house submission procedure for a choked barrel, which required a separate overpressure test to verify that the constriction itself did not create a structural weakness in the steel at the point of maximum bore reduction. This last point was not incidental. A poorly executed choke, cut too aggressively, left with an abrupt rather than a gradual taper, bored into barrel steel of insufficient wall thickness at the muzzle, could produce a dangerous weapon rather than an improved one. The proof house's role in validating choked barrels was therefore not merely procedural. It was the mechanism by which Greener's innovation was separated from its imitations. The Birmingham Proof House on Banbury Street, established by Act of Parliament in 1813, its proof marks a legal guarantee recognized across the British Empire and, under reciprocal arrangements, in several continental European markets. Stamped every choke-bored barrel that passed its tests with the same market placed on a cylinder bore. The distinction in the market was the name on the rib. Greener's name commanded a premium that his competitors could not immediately close. The physical form of a best quality Greener shotgun of the late 1870s and 1880s was the product of the full gun quarter subcontract chain, assembled and finished at St. Mary's Row under Greener's own inspection regime. A matched pair of 12-bore side-by-side side-lock ejector guns, a side-lock being the action type in which the lockwork, the springs, tumblers, and sears that govern the firing sequence are mounted on separate plates fitted to the side of the action body, rather than within the action itself, allowing independent removal for inspection and repair without disturbing the stock. Hand-fitted to a customer's measurements, proofed at Banbury Street, engraved to the customer's specification, and cased in a fitted oak and leather case with cleaning rods, snap caps, and a copy of the current Greener catalogue. Retailed in the early 1880s at prices ranging from approximately 12 to 30 guineas, depending on the grade of engraving and the quality of the walnut stock selected. 30 guineas in 1882, roughly 6 months' wages for a skilled barrel borer in the gun quarter, working a full week at the standard trade rate, for a pair of guns that the firm guaranteed to pattern within a defined density specification at 40 yards. The guarantee was not a marketing claim. It was a technical commitment backed by documented trial results. No other Birmingham maker of equivalent scale was offering anything comparable in writing. The go-to-market strategy that carried Greener beyond the gun quarter relied on 3 simultaneous channels. The Army and Navy Cooperative Society catalogue, distributed to officers, colonial administrators, and gentlemen sportsmen across the empire, listed Greener guns at fixed retail prices that made the brand accessible to a customer base that would never visit St. Mary's Row in person. Export agents in Calcutta, Cape Town, Rangoon, and Melbourne carried stock for the colonial sporting and police markets. And the trade exhibitions, the Colonial and Indian Exhibition of 1886, the series of Birmingham industrial exhibitions through the 1870s and 1880s, provided the public demonstration platform that Greener used with consistent effectiveness, returning with medals and commendations that he reproduced in every subsequent catalogue. The Royal Warrant of Appointment, by appointment to His Majesty the King, Gunmaker, was not a decoration. It was the moat. A royal warrant, granted by the Lord Chamberlain's office on evidence of regular supply to the royal household, permitted the holder to display the royal arms on trade materials, packaging, and premises. In an era when royal association was the single most powerful brand endorsement available to a British manufacturer selling into imperial markets where the Crown's authority was simultaneously commercial and constitutional, the warrant was worth more than any number of exhibition medals. It told a district commissioner in Lahore, a police superintendent in Natal, and a planting company's procurement officer in Rangoon that the guns they were ordering had already been assessed and found acceptable by the institution that governed the empire that employed them. Greener held the warrant. His competitors noted it. His export catalogs displayed it on the cover. The early institutional client list, built through the 1880s and 1890s, reflects the reach that the warrant and the export network made possible. The British South Africa Company's police force, the forerunner of the British South Africa Police, carried Greener guns. The Indian Army's various provincial police establishments placed orders through the Calcutta agents. The Egyptian police, reorganized under British administration following the 1882 occupation, specified Greener arms for certain categories of service issue. The Cape Mounted Rifles, the Queensland Colonial Police, and, from the mid-1880s onward, an institutional client that would define the firm's most distinctive and enduring product line, the colonial prison and public order establishment across British India, East Africa, and the Straits settlements. The product that served this last market was not a shotgun. It was the Greener GP, the Greener Police Gun. A single-barrel, single-shot, top-lever break-action shotgun chambered for a proprietary cartridge with a specially shaped base that prevented it from being chambered in any standard sporting gun. The design logic was explicit and deliberate. A weapon issued to colonial police auxiliaries and prison warders in territories where the authorities feared that standard-caliber ammunition, if stolen or diverted, could be used against the issuing power's own forces. The GP's cartridge could not be used in any weapon except a GP. The weapon was, in the most literal engineering sense, its own containment system. By one account, the Indian authorities alone took delivery of several thousand GP guns across the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. The exact figures are not universally documented, but the GP appears in Indian Army and colonial police procurement records with a consistency that suggests a supply relationship spanning at least 3 decades. Production at St. Mary's Row by the mid-1890s covered the full range: best quality side-lock ejector pairs for the sporting market, mid-grade box-lock ejectors, a box lock being the action type in which the lockwork is contained within the action body itself, a simpler and more economical construction than the side lock, less prestigious but mechanically sound and suited to hard colonial service use, for the export trade, and the GP series for institutional supply. The workforce, by trade catalogue references of the period, had grown to encompass the full range of gun quarter specialist trades under one commercial roof, with Greener's own inspection and proofing protocols applied at each stage before the finished arms left St. Mary's Row. And then W. Greener did something that none of his competitors had done, and that none of them could have done with equivalent authority. He wrote it all down. The Gun and Its Development, first published in 1881, revised through 9 editions, the final edition appearing in 1910, was not a trade catalogue or a promotional document. It was the authoritative technical reference on British firearms design, manufacture, proof, and use, written by the man who had spent 30 years doing it. It covered barrel metallurgy, proof house procedure, choke boring theory, action design, cartridge ballistics, stock fitting, cleaning, storage, and the history of British gun making from the matchlock forward. It was translated. It was cited by competitors. It was adopted as a reference text by proof house officials and military procurement officers who needed to assess unfamiliar designs against a documented standard. For W. Greener had invented the dominant improvement in shotgun ballistics of his generation. He had won the patent dispute that established his priority. He had built the export network and held the royal warrant, and he had written the book, literally, on how British guns were made. The peak was real. The scale of what followed made it necessary to understand exactly how high it had been. By 1900, the name W. Greener meant something precise and specific in every territory administered under the British Crown, and in several that were not. It meant a choke-bored barrel that had been proven at Banbury, every street and guaranteed to pattern within a documented density specification. It meant an action fitted by hand on St. Mary's Row to tolerances that the Birmingham subcontract system had spent 2 centuries. Hold. It meant a royal warrant displayed on the catalogue cover and a textbook on the shelf of every serious gun-making establishment from Edinburgh to Calcutta that needed to know whether a design was sound. These were not separate claims. They were a single, integrated commercial proposition, and in the first decade of the 20th century, W. Greener was delivering on all 3 simultaneously. The institutional client list of the Edwardian peak reflects the full geographic scope of what that proposition had built. The Indian Army's various provincial police and auxiliary establishments continued to take GP guns in quantity. The proprietary cartridge system that locked the weapon to its own ammunition supply had made the GP the default choice for colonial public order authorities across the subcontinent, where the practical problem of issued weapons becoming available to the population they were intended to control was a procurement consideration that shaped every contract. The Egyptian police, operating under British administrative direction following the Cromer years, maintained Greener in their standard equipment lists into the early 1900s. The British South Africa Police, by now a formed constabulary rather than a company force, operating across Rhodesia and the administered territories of the British South Africa Company's former domain, had Greener arms in service. The Straits Settlements Police, administering Singapore, Penang, and Malacca under the Colonial Office, specified Greener GP guns for prison and public order duties. The Uganda Protectorate's nascent police establishment, the British East Africa Protectorate, the Gold Coast Constabulary, the civilian sporting market ran alongside this institutional business on a separate but equally important track. The matched pair side-lock ejector trade, the highest value product Greener offered, hand-fitted over weeks of bench time by the firm's most experienced action filers and stockmakers, served a customer base of landed gentry, colonial administrators on home leave, and the upper tier of the professional classes for whom a driven game shoot required guns that could handle 300 cartridges in a morning without mechanical failure and be presented to a guest's inspection without embarrassment. What these customers were paying for, beyond the proof mark in the royal warrant, was fitting. Stock fitting. The adjustment of the stock's length, cast, drop at heel, and drop at comb to the individual shooter's physique and mount, was not a luxury addition to a Greener best gun. It was a technical requirement for consistent pattern placement. A gun that does not fit its user does not shoot where the user looks. Greener's fitting process, conducted at St. Mary's Row with a tri-gun, an adjustable stock assembly that allowed the fitter to observe the customer's mount and mark the precise geometry required before the final stock was cut, was documented in the firm's catalogues as a standard service, not a premium option. In the Birmingham trade of 1900, that was still a distinction worth stating in print. Production output across the Greener range in the Edwardian period cannot be precisely quantified from surviving secondary sources, but trade catalogue evidence and proof house submission records suggest an annual throughput of several hundred completed guns across all grades, a figure that placed Greener above the typical small gun quarter workshop but considerably below the volume manufacturers supplying the lower end of the retail trade. The firm was, by deliberate commercial choice, a quality house operating in the middle and upper tiers of the market, not a production facility competing on price. The workforce at St. Mary's Row in this period comprised, by the firm's own trade references, a concentration of specialist craftsmen covering the full production sequence under one roof, an unusual arrangement in a gun quarter where subcontract outworking remained the norm for most makers of equivalent scale. Greener had, over the preceding 3 decades, progressively brought more of the production chain inside the St. Mary's Row premises: barrel preparation, action fitting, stocking, engraving, and finishing all conducted on site, with only the primary barrel forging and the initial barrel boring outsourced to the specialist trade that still operated in the surrounding streets. This integration was a quality decision, not an efficiency one. It allowed Greener's own inspection regime to operate at every stage of production rather than only at the point of final assembly. It also meant that the craft knowledge concentrated at St. Mary's Row was specific to Greener's own standards, held by individual craftsmen who had been trained inside the firm's own methods, not the general gun quarter trade practice. That concentration of knowledge would matter later. It always does. Then came August 1914. The declaration of war on the 4th of August reached the Birmingham gun quarter as it reached every manufacturing district in Britain. Not as a surprise exactly, but as an acceleration. The War Office mobilization orders that followed in the weeks after the declaration did not immediately reach every small maker in the trade. The priority contracts went first to the large integrated manufacturers, BSA at Small Heath, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock, the established military contractors whose production lines could be converted to service rifle and component manufacture with known quantities of tooling and known workforces. Greener's position in the mobilization was shaped by the nature of its production. The St. Mary's Row works were not configured for mass military production. The firm's value to the war effort lay not in volume, but in precision, in the fitting room skills and the inspection disciplines that had built the Greener reputation across 3 decades of civilian and colonial production. By 1915, the works were operating under Ministry of Munitions direction. The civilian sporting production that had sustained St. Mary's Row was suspended, not closed, suspended. The order books remained, the customer relationships remained, the intention to return remained, and the workforce was redirected to military component manufacture. The specific contracts Greener held under Ministry of Munitions direction are not fully documented in surviving secondary sources, and the precise components produced required archival verification, but the pattern was consistent across the gun quarter. Precision fitting rooms became component inspection facilities. Stock makers moved to wooden component preparation for service rifles. Action filers worked on government pattern lock assemblies. Harry Greener, W.W.'s son, who had been managing the operational direction of the firm for several years before 1914 as his father moved into his 80s, oversaw the transition. W.W. himself was 80 years old in 1914. He had founded the firm's modern form before the Franco-Prussian War. He had filed the choke-boring patent before the Zulu War. He had written the first edition of the gun and its development before the First Boer War. He was, by any measure, the senior surviving figure of the Victorian gun quarter trade. The stakes of what the works were now contributing to were not abstract. A Lee Enfield receiver incorrectly fitted at the locking lug engagement, the point at which the bolts locking lugs seat into the receiver raceway to contain the pressure of firing, would fail at the moment of highest stress. The instant of cartridge detonation in a forward trench at Gallipoli, or a fire trench on the Somme, where a rifleman holding a section perimeter had the contents of his magazine and nothing else between his position and the enemy's. Precision fitting was not a refinement in this context. It was the difference between a weapon and a liability. The Birmingham Proof House continued to operate through the war years, submitting military barrels to proof alongside the diminished civilian trade that continued in the surrounding streets. The Greener name on a component that passed through the St. Mary's Row inspection regime carried for the duration exactly the same guarantee it had carried on a best-grade side-lock ejector shipped to a colonial administrator's bungalow in Rangoon. The work had been checked by hand by people who knew what they were looking for. The firm received a Ministry of Munitions commendation for its precision work during the war period. The specific date and citation details require archival confirmation, but the recognition is noted in secondary trade sources covering the Birmingham gun quarter's wartime contribution. W. Greener himself survived the war. He died in 1921 at the age of 86. Having seen the trade he had entered as a young man in his father's workshop transformed by the percussion cap, the breech-loading cartridge, the choke bore, the self-loading action, 2 colonial wars, and 1 industrial war that had consumed the civilian manufacturing economy and returned it, diminished, to a world in which the political appetite for privately held firearms had been permanently altered. The Firearms Act, 1920, passed in the aftermath of the war, the Easter Rising, and the social anxieties of a government managing a demobilized and heavily armed population, introduced the certificate system for civilian handgun and rifle ownership that would form the legislative architecture of British firearms restriction for the rest of the century. It was the first significant peacetime restriction on civilian firearms ownership in British history. Its immediate commercial consequence was a contraction of the lower and middle tiers of the civilian arms market. Its long-term consequence was the progressive removal of the civilian customer base that had cross-subsidized quality gunmakers through the lean years between military contracts. Greener's best gun trade was insulated from the immediate impact. A customer purchasing a 30-guinea side-lock ejector pair was not buying a handgun or a military pattern rifle. The Act's primary target was the categories of arms that had the most obvious public order implications. Shotgun ownership remained relatively unaffected at this stage, but the trajectory had been established. The direction of travel was clear. Harry Greener read it. The firm adjusted. The colonial and export trade continued. The GP gun found new institutional customers as the British Empire's various constabulary and prison establishments continued their procurement cycles through the 1920s and into the 1930s. The civilian sporting trade recovered partially in the interwar years, the driven game shoot remaining a viable market for the upper tier of the trade, even as the middle ground contracted. The works at St. Mary's Row continued, but WW was gone. And with him went something that no succession plan had ever fully addressed: the specific combination of engineering authority, polemical confidence, and documented public advocacy that had made Greener not merely a gunmaker, but the gunmaker, the one whose name the trade used when it needed to know whether an idea was sound. Harry Greener was a capable manager. He was not his father. No one was. The turning point was not a single decision. It never is. It was a convergence. 4 forces arriving across 4 decades, each one manageable in isolation, collectively terminal. And the firm that had survived a patent war, 2 world wars, and the death of its founder did not fail to see them coming. It failed to find a response adequate to their combined weight. The first force arrived in 1920, and it never left. The Firearms Act of that year had not destroyed Greener's market, but it had established the principle that civilian ownership of firearms was a privilege to be certificated and monitored, not a commercial transaction to be conducted across a shop counter, and that principle would be applied with increasing severity across the following 7 decades. The Firearms Act, 1968, consolidated the earlier legislation into a comprehensive framework that tightened the certificate system and raised the administrative burden on both dealers and buyers. The Firearms Amendment Act, 1988, passed in the aftermath of the Hungerford Massacre, in which a licensed owner killed 16 people with legally held firearms, banned semi-automatic centerfire rifles, and restricted pump-action shotguns, categories that did not directly affect Greener's core product, but that accelerated the cultural and political association between civilian firearms, ownership, and public danger that shaped every subsequent legislative discussion. And then came Dunblane. The Firearms Amendment Act, 1997, passed in the months following the murder of 16 children and their teacher at Dunblane Primary School in March 1996, banned virtually all handguns in mainland Britain. Its commercial consequences for what remained of the British pistol and sporting arms trade were catastrophic. Greener did not manufacture handguns as a primary product line, but the Act did not operate in isolation. It was the final expression of a legislative trajectory that had, across 77 years, removed the civilian customer base that had once cross-subsidized every quality gunmaker in the Birmingham trade through the years between institutional contracts. By 1997, The civilian market that W. Greener had served from St. Mary's Row was, for practical purposes, gone. The second force had arrived decades earlier, from a direction that no amount of patent litigation or royal warrant prestige could have deflected. The British Empire contracted. Between 1947 and 1968, the institutional client network that had sustained Greener's GP gun production across half a century was dismantled by decolonization at a pace that left no time for commercial adjustment. India achieved independence in 1947, and the Indian provincial police and prison establishments that had taken GP guns in quantity since the 1880s became procurement authorities of a sovereign state with its own arms manufacturing capability at the Ishapur rifle factory, and its own political incentives to reduce dependence on British suppliers. The Gold Coast became Ghana in 1957. Malaya achieved independence in the same year, removing the Straits Settlements Police from the British colonial procurement network. Nigeria in 1960. Uganda in 1962. Kenya in 1963. Each independence transferred a Greener institutional client from the British Colonial Office's procurement chain to a sovereign government's own supply arrangements. The GP gun's defining commercial advantage, its proprietary cartridge system, which had made it the default choice for authorities who feared issued weapons being turned against them, became, in the context of post-colonial procurement, a liability. A newly independent government, purchasing arms for its own police force, had no reason to lock itself into a proprietary British cartridge when standard international calibers were available from a dozen suppliers at competitive prices. The GP gun's institutional market did not collapse overnight. Orders continued into the 1950s and, by some accounts, beyond. But the pipeline that had once connected St. Mary's Row directly to the procurement offices of 24 colonial administrations was being closed, one independence ceremony at a time. The third force was closer to home, and in some ways more damaging precisely because it arrived wearing the language of modernization. The British industrial rationalization programs of the post-war decades, operating under various ministerial committees, Board of Trade Reviews, and the broad ideological framework that identified small specialist manufacturers as inefficient anomalies in a modern industrial economy, viewed the gun quarter's subcontract ecosystem with the same impatience they directed at Sheffield's cutlery trade, at Coventry's specialist component makers, at every industrial district whose commercial logic was legibility to those who understood the trade and opacity to those who did not. BSA, the Birmingham Small Arms Company, whose small heath works on Golden Hillock Road had been the largest arms complex in the British Empire at its wartime peak, had by the 1960s become a diversified industrial conglomerate, managing motorcycles, bicycles, machine tools, and the remnants of its arms manufacturing capability under a single corporate structure whose strategic priorities were determined by market conditions that had nothing to do with the gun quarter. BSA's absorption of smaller Birmingham gunmakers through this period followed the logic of conglomerate acquisition. The name had value. The customer relationships had value. The physical premises had value. The craft knowledge held in the hands of the workers on the factory floor was not an asset that appeared on any balance sheet BSA's accountants prepared. Greener's relationship with BSA in this period is not fully documented in surviving secondary sources, and the precise terms and timing of any formal acquisition or absorption require archival verification. What is clear from trade records and the firm's subsequent history is that the independence of operation that had defined St. Mary's Row under W. and Harry Greener did not survive into the latter half of the 20th century intact. The commercial and production decisions that had once been made on St. Mary's Row by people who had spent their working lives on St. Mary's Row were increasingly made elsewhere by people whose relationship to the gun quarter was financial rather than physical. The fourth force was the one that could not be legislated against, acquired away, or compensated for by export development. When the St. Mary's Row works reduced in scale, when the order books thinned and the workforce contracted and the full production chain that WW had spent 30 years consolidating under one roof began to fragment. The knowledge that left with each departing craftsman did not transfer to a document. The action filer who had spent 20 years learning the specific geometry of a Greener Sidelock's sear engagement did not write it down before he left. The barrel fitter who could assess a choke constriction by touch, who knew, from the resistance of the reamer against his hand, whether the taper was cutting true or drifting, did not leave a manual. The stocker who could read the grain of a piece of Turkish walnut and know, before the first cut, where the figure would emerge and where the wood would want to split, took that knowledge home with him. This was not negligence. It was the nature of embodied craft knowledge in a trade that had always transmitted itself through apprenticeship and direct physical instruction rather than written specification. The Birmingham subcontract system had operated on this basis for 2 centuries. It worked when the craftsmen were there. When they were gone, it did not work at all. The production of best quality Greener guns did not end on a single date. It attenuated, orders fulfilled more slowly. Waiting lists extended, the grade of work available declining incrementally as the craftsmen who could produce it retired or moved to other trades. The institutional GP gun orders continued longer than the sporting trade, sustained by the residual colonial and post-colonial police markets that had not yet fully converted to alternative suppliers. But the trajectory was established, and the sentences that describe what followed are, by the nature of what happened, short. The civilian sporting market narrowed year by year. The colonial contracts expired one by one. The craftsmen retired. No apprentices replaced them. The St. Mary's Row works reduced to a fraction of their Edwardian scale. The Royal Warrant, once displayed on every catalogue cover shipped to Calcutta and Cape Town, became a historical notation. The name survived, the works did not. The specific date on which production of new Greener guns at St. Mary's Row effectively ceased. Not the date the firm was legally wound up or acquired, but the date the last hand-fitted gun left the bench is not precisely recorded in the secondary sources available. It was not marked by a ceremony. There was no final proof submission recorded with unusual ceremony at Banbury Street. The capstan lathes cooled. The fitting room emptied. The St. Mary's Row address, which had been one of the most specific and reliable engineering claims in the British sporting arms trade, became a postal history. The giant that nobody remembers had not been defeated. It had been, in the most precise sense, discontinued. The name W.W. Greener did not disappear entirely. Names rarely do when the thing that bore them was sufficiently well made. In the years following the effective cessation of St. Mary's Row production, the Greener trademark passed through a sequence of holders whose relationship to the original firm was commercial rather than craft. A company trading as W.W. Greener Limited has existed in various forms in the decades since the works closed, and guns bearing the Greener name have been produced or assembled from components under that banner. What changed in the product was precisely what always changes when a name outlives the workshop that made it specific. The hand-fitting, the in-house inspection regime, the proof submission discipline applied at every stage of production rather than only at the point of final assembly. These are not processes that can be purchased with a trademark. They are processes that require the people who know how to do them to be present, working, and teaching. The trademark was acquired. The people were not transferable. What the secondary market for original Greener production has demonstrated, across the decades since St. Mary's Row fell silent, is that the guns themselves made the argument that the firm's final years could not. At Holt's, the specialist firearms auction house whose catalogue is the primary price discovery mechanism for quality British sporting arms in the secondary market, a matched pair of best quality W.W. Greener sidelock ejectors in original condition, retaining their original case, cleaning equipment and trade documentation, commands prices that reflect not merely their rarity but their functional superiority over much of what has been produced since. The specific figures vary by condition, grade, and provenance, but the premium over equivalent-era Birmingham production from makers of lesser reputation is consistent and significant. At Bonhams, where British sporting arms appear in the arms and armour sales alongside London trade guns from Purdy, Holland, and Boss, Greener best guns occupy the tier below the London trade's most celebrated names but above the general Birmingham commercial production, a positioning that reflects the market's accurate assessment of where Greener's quality actually sat. Not quite the South Audley Street level, but unambiguously above the trade average that surrounded St. Mary's Row. The collector community that sustains this market is served by the Historical Breech-Loading Small Arms Association, the HBSA, whose membership includes the serious students of British gun-making history, for whom a Greener choke-bored barrel of the 1880s is not a curiosity but a primary source. The Royal Armouries at Leeds holds examples of Greener production across several categories, including GP guns from the colonial period, whose institutional markings document the supply chain that carried St. Mary's Row's work to police establishments across the empire. The National Firearms Centre at Nottingham, the Pattern Room Collection, the most comprehensive reference assembly of British and Commonwealth military and police firearms in existence, holds GP variants that represent the full development sequence of the type from its introduction through its final colonial service iterations. These institutions are where serious collectors go to understand what Greener actually produced. They are not where the general public goes. The general public does not know the name. There is a specific reason that original Greener production cannot be replaced by modern equivalents for certain uses, and it has nothing to do with sentiment. A Greener best quality side-lock ejector, hand-fitted at St. Mary's Row in the 1890s or 1900s, has a lock timing, the precise sequence and speed with which the tumbler falls, the firing pin strikes, and the ejectors operate. That was set by an action filer working to a standard established by W. Greener's own documented specifications and refined across decades of production. The lock timing interacts with the specific choke geometry of the barrels, the cartridge specifications of the period, and the stock geometry fitted to the original owner's measurements to produce a gun that shoots where the user looks with a consistency that modern production, for all its CNC precision, cannot fully replicate because it does not replicate the fitting process that produced the original result. Target shooters competing under HBSA classification rules, who may use original British sporting arms in certain categories, understand this. They do not always explain it to people who have not shot both. The physical site of the Greener Works at St. Mary's Row, Birmingham, is no longer a gun-making premises. The gun quarter that surrounded it, the dense network of garret workshops and small manufactories that had made Birmingham the commercial gun-making capital of the British Isles from the 1690s onward, has been substantially redeveloped across the post-war decades, the Victorian industrial fabric replaced by a mixture of light industrial units, residential conversion, and the particular kind of urban vacancy that accumulates in districts whose economic reason for existence has been removed without replacement. A small number of historic buildings survive in the streets adjacent to St. Mary's Row. The Birmingham Proof House on Banbury Street, established 1813, still operating, still submitting barrels to proof under the statutory authority of the Birmingham Gun Barrel Proof Act 1868, remains the most significant surviving physical institution of the gun quarter trade. It is, in this context, an anomaly. A functioning proof house in a district that has almost nothing left to proof. The surprise that the Greener story carries into its final pages is bibliographic rather than biographical, and it is, on reflection, the most Greener thing imaginable. The gun and its development. 9 editions. First published 1881, final edition 1910. Never went out of circulation in the way that the works at St. Mary's Row went out of production. It was reprinted. It was cited in subsequent technical literature. It was held in the reference collections of proof houses, military procurement offices, and gun-making establishments on 4 continents. Facsimile editions have been produced in the decades since the original printing run ended. Copies in good condition appear regularly at auction and in the catalogues of specialist booksellers dealing in technical and sporting literature, priced not as curiosities but as working reference texts, because the mechanical principles W. Greener, documented in 1881, have not been superseded by anything more authoritative written since. The man who could not be fully replaced as a manufacturer left behind a document that replaced itself automatically, edition by edition, reprint by reprint, across a century and a half of British gun-making history. His competitors read it. Their successors read it. The proof house officials who assessed their submissions used it as a reference. The military procurement officers who evaluated their designs consulted it. The collectors who now pay significant sums for the guns it describes use it to understand what they are holding. W. Greener wrote the book on British gun-making. The book outlasted the gunmaker, the works, the gun quarter, the empire, and the civilian market that had made all of them possible. What does a city lose when it loses its gun works? It loses the specific form of precision knowledge that the works concentrated: the lock filers, the barrel borers, the action fitters, the proof house inspectors who knew the difference between a barrel that was safe and a barrel that was good. It loses the apprenticeship chain that transmitted that knowledge across generations without writing it down, because it did not need to be written down as long as the people who held it were still at the bench. It loses the institutional memory of what it means to make something to a standard rather than to a price, and the cultural confidence that comes from knowing that the name on the rib is an engineering claim, not a marketing one. Birmingham lost the gun quarter gradually, over the second half of the 20th century, by the operation of forces that no individual firm and no individual craftsman could have resisted alone. The proof house remains. The trade records remain. The guns remain, in collections, in auction catalogues, in the pattern room at Nottingham, in the hands of HBSA members who shoot them on summer mornings at targets that the original customers never imagined. The knowledge that made them is held now by a diminishing number of people who learned it late and from sources that were already secondary. When those people are gone, the knowledge will exist only in the guns themselves, in the geometry of a choke, in the timing of a lock, in the fitting of an action to a stock that was cut to measurements taken by a man on St. Mary's Row who understood what he was doing and did not think it necessary to explain why. A best-quality Greener sidelock ejector, assembled at St. Mary's Row in the last decade of the 19th century, still breaks its targets cleanly at 40 yards, the choke geometry holding its pattern exactly as the patent of 1874 promised it would. The proof mark on the barrel flat still legible. The St. Mary's Row address on the action still specific, still true. Still the most precise thing stamped into the steel. The gun remembers. The works do not exist to be remembered. See you in the next one.